Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're pointing our compass south, way, way south, to take the ultimate geopolitical temperature check on the coldest, most fragile, and, well, maybe the most politically unique place on Earth, Antarctica.
It really is.
And this isn't just about, preserving ice and penguins. It's about understanding the only major landmass governed entirely by this extraordinary system of international cooperation, a system born of all times at the absolute height of the Cold War.
It's the world's most pristine wilderness, there's no question. And it functions as this unrivaled natural laboratory. It's critical to global climate science. But you've hit on the key point there. It's the governance.
Right.
This entire continent is managed not as a territory for any single nation, but as a space reserved just for peace and science. And that mechanism, the Antarctic Treaty System, has had an incredibly strong track record, over 60 years of global conflict and competition.
Okay, so let's unpack this Cold War miracle. We've got a set of sources here, from legal texts like the Madrid Protocol to geopolitical analyses of, recent infrastructure buildups, and they all seem to point to the same thing. The system is under immense pressure.
It is.
The original treaty, signed December 1st, 1959, was, for all intents and purposes, a peace treaty. It took 12 states, the ones who were active during the International Geophysical Year, and somehow got them to set their differences aside.
And its foundational achievement was just its sheer ambition. The mission was to ensure Antarctica is used exclusively for peaceful purposes and, critically, that it does not become the scene or object of international discord. I mean, that was an audacious, almost impossible goal back then.
And today?
Today, that whole framework is facing a trifecta of stress. You have accelerating biophysical change from climate warming, you have renewed geopolitical competition, and you have this sort of veiled resource rivalry. We're going to explore why that great consensus of 1959 is now harder than ever to maintain, and, well, what happens to the planet if it fails?
To really get the genius and, I guess, the fragility of the treaty, you have to rewind to the time before 1959. People forget this wasn't an empty, passive frontier. This was a place with active, sometimes violent, territorial disputes.
Well, absolutely.
It makes the final agreement seem nothing short of miraculous. How serious were the tensions, really? Especially with 7 original claimants all jostling for position?
The pre-treaty environment was genuinely explosive. You had 7 nations, Argentina, Australia, Chile, France, New Zealand, Norway, and the UK, all asserting sovereignty claims that were overlapping and often conflicted.
Some were more tense than others, right?
Well, the UK, Argentina, and Chile in particular had these huge swaths of overlapping territory on the Antarctic Peninsula, which is the most accessible and, strategically important part of the continent. The situation was tense enough that minor military skirmishes weren't just a threat, they were a reality.
Okay, give us the specifics, because hearing about military incidents in Antarctica today just sounds
Sure.
absurd. But it shows how close we came to open conflict down there.
It really does. There are 2 incidents that really demonstrate the hostility.
Oh.
In 1952, you have the famous Hope Bay incident. An Argentine team was trying to establish a presence in a contested area.
Right.
And the Argentine military fired warning shots, not blanks, but warning shots, at a group of Britons who were approaching their base. This wasn't some minor disagreement. This was military action.
And the UK responded in kind.
They did.
Yeah.
But the most dramatic incident came a year later, in 1953, at Deception Island. The Argentines had reopened a refuge there. So on February 15th, the British retaliated in force.
In force meaning?
Meaning the frigate HMS Snipe landed 32 Royal Marines armed with Sten machine guns and rifles. They captured 2 Argentine sailors, destroyed the Argentine refuge, and also took out a nearby Chilean shelter just to make a point.
Wow. That is not scientific research. That is localized military conflict in a place most of the world wasn't even thinking about.
Precisely. They were actively sending warships into the area. The situation got so unsustainable that Argentina, Chile, and the UK had to take this crucial de-escalation step. They signed the Tripartite Naval Declaration in 1949.
What did that do?
It was a commitment not to send warships south of the 60th parallel. It was a temporary diplomatic band-aid, basically, renewed every year until 1961, just to stop things from boiling over until they could find a permanent solution.
And that permanent solution, the treaty, didn't just appear out of nowhere. It was profoundly shaped by U.S. policy that was decades old at that point. The Hughes Doctrine.
That's the intellectual bedrock, yes.
Yeah.
The Hughes Doctrine from 1924 stipulated that the U.S. wouldn't recognize sovereignty claims in areas that couldn't be actively settled, and Antarctica fit that definition perfectly.
Which is interesting because the U.S. had the muscle to make a claim. They were running huge mapping operations like Operation High Jump. It looked a lot like the groundwork for a claim.
It did. And internally, the Navy and State Department had definitely considered it. But the doctrine gave them the strategic middle ground. Eisenhower's decision in 1958 to champion a multilateral treaty wasn't purely altruistic. It was strategic.
How so?
The U.S. realized that if they pressed a claim, it would just trigger a cascade of counterclaims, probably involving the Soviet Union, who had a big presence from the International Geophysical Year. So Eisenhower decided U.S. objectives, guaranteed access for science, no military use, were better achieved by a system that neutralized all the claims.
By holding them in abeyance.
Exactly. Article 4 of the treaty, it's the absolute masterpiece of the whole thing. It basically says, you can keep your claim, we're just not going to talk about it or recognize it. It postponed the hardest question indefinitely.
Okay, so with that political groundwork laid, the 1959 treaty then sets up these three pillars to manage the continent. Let's break those down. First, peace.
On peace, the rules were exceptionally strong for the time. Article 1 prohibits all military activities. No bases, no fortifications, no maneuvers, no weapons testing. It made the treaty one of the earliest, most successful arms control agreements of the Cold War.
But military personnel are still allowed down there.
Yes, and that's the critical nuance. Military personnel and equipment are allowed, but only if they are being used for scientific research or other peaceful purposes. So the U.S. Navy can run support missions, just not combat drills.
And the second pillar, science, became the sort of unifying, non-political currency of the whole region.
It really did. Science replaced competition. Article 2 guarantees freedom of scientific investigation, and Article 3, which was revolutionary, mandates the free exchange of all scientific data and results. That required a radical level of trust among Cold War adversaries. It's how we got foundational discoveries, like the initial identification of the ozone hole.
Finally, the governance structure. It's not just one document, it's a whole system, right?
It's the Antarctic Treaty System, or ATS. It's managed by the Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meetings, the ATCMs. These involve the original 12 signatories, plus other states who can join if they conduct substantial scientific research there.
And they meet every year.
Annually, yes. To exchange information and agree on what are called measures binding decisions that govern the continent. And since 2004, all that diplomatic complexity is managed by the Antarctic Treaty Secretariat, which is strategically based in Buenos Aires, a nice nod to one of the original claimant states.
So the 1959 treaty achieved political stability, but then as we get into the 1980s, the focus shifts pretty dramatically toward the environment. This brings us to what you call ATS 2.0, headlined by the Madrid Protocol in 1991. What was the catalyst for that?
It was driven by two things: a growing global environmental consciousness and, more critically, the very real threat of mineral exploitation. Before 1991, several states were actually negotiating something called CRAMRA, the Convention on the Regulation of Antarctic Mineral Resource Activities. It would have regulated and eventually permitted commercial mining.
So it would have opened the door.
It would have. And there was a massive global opposition to it, led by countries like Australia and France. They argued that regulating mining implicitly meant you were accepting it. The Madrid Protocol was the response. It shut that door completely, designating Antarctica as a natural reserve devoted to peace and science.
And the most famous part of that is the mining ban.
Absolutely. Article 7 explicitly prohibits all activities relating to mineral resources, except for scientific research. It's the single most powerful environmental protection in the system, and it is indefinite. It mandates that all the potential fossil fuel and mineral wealth under the ice has to be left untouched.
Okay, here is where we have to tackle the biggest piece of misinformation about the whole system, this idea that the ban expires in 2048. You hear that date all the time.
It's a critical misconception, and it creates this false sense of a looming crisis. The mining ban does not expire in 2048.
So what is 2048?
2048 is simply the first date, 50 years after the protocol came into force, when any of the consultative parties can request a review conference. But just requesting a conference is the first tiny step.
And changing it is much harder.
It's a nearly impossible hurdle.
Right.
To change the ban, you'd need a 3/4 majority of the consultative parties to agree. And even then, that change has to be ratified by a majority, including all of the original parties who adopted the protocol in the first place.
That is a massive legislative firewall. So it's basically indefinite unless there's some huge, sustained global consensus to change it.
Precisely. It was designed to be virtually permanent. And the parties actually reaffirmed that in 2023 at the Helsinki Declaration, specifically to counter this 2048 expiration myth.
Okay, so the land is protected legally, but the system still seems to have some pretty big gaps, especially around liability. What happens if there's a disaster, like a major oil spill from a research ship?
That's the ongoing challenge, the liability gap. There's a document, Annex 6, which deals with liability arising from environmental emergencies. It was adopted back in 2005.
And it requires operators to have insurance, right?
Yes, it requires operators, including non-state tour operators, to have adequate financial security or insurance to cover cleanup costs.
But is it functional?
Well, here's the problem. Annex 60 has yet to enter into force.
Wait, all these years later?
All these years later, it's a perfect example of the ATS's structural slowness. So while the rules exist on paper, the binding, internationally agreed mechanism for dealing with the financial fallout of a major disaster, it's just not fully active.
But before anyone even starts an activity, there are some pretty robust assessment procedures, a tiered approach. Can you walk us through that?
Sure. It's designed to assess risk before anything happens. Every proposed activity first gets a preliminary screening to see if the impact will be less than a minor or transitory impact. If it's really small, it can proceed pretty easily.
And never something bigger.
If it's likely to have more than a minor or transitory impact, you have to prepare an initial environmental evaluation, an IEE, that forces you to assess the effects, consider alternatives, and put mitigation measures in place.
And what triggers the top level of scrutiny? What's an example of something that would need a comprehensive environmental evaluation?
A great example would be building a huge new research station, like the Chinese Kunling Station, or a new runway for large aircraft. Anything with major earth moving or a big increase in waste, that triggers a CEE.
And that's a much bigger deal.
Oh, it's incredibly detailed. You have to forecast future impacts, including cumulative ones, and circulate a draft to all the other parties for a mandatory 90-day comment period before you can even make a decision. It's an essential political and environmental safeguard.
That's vital, but as you said, all this protection on land just shifts the pressure somewhere else, to the surrounding Southern Ocean, which is a tenth of the world's ocean surface, and that required a whole separate structure, CCMLR.
Right. The Convention for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, or CCMLR, was set up in 1982. It was a direct response to the late 70s when global fleets, mostly Soviet and Japanese, were starting to hoover up krill, the absolute foundation of the Antarctic food web.
And CCMLR's approach was pretty innovative for its time, this ecosystem-based management. What does that mean in practice?
It was revolutionary. It meant you had to conserve all the marine resources, not just the commercially valuable fish. Ecosystem-based management, or EBM, means that fisheries have to be managed in a way that maintains the ecological relationships between what you're harvesting, like krill, and the populations that depend on it, like seals, whales, and penguins.
But this is where the big conflict comes in, right? The tension between conservation and this term rational use. Why is that phrase so problematic?
This is arguably the core legal and political fight within the modern system. Article 2 of the Convention says that conservation includes rational use. The framers put that in to appease the big fishing nations.
Who insisted on the right to fish.
Exactly. But rational has no specific binding definition. So fishing states, and we're talking primarily China, Russia, South Korea, and Norway, they interpret rational use politically. They see it as an enshrined right to fish.
Which means when scientists recommend conservation measures,
They use the rational use clause to demand higher quotas or to veto the creation of marine protected areas. They argue that conservation can't preclude sustainable harvesting. And this political interpretation, often overriding science, is why CCAMLR's consensus process is basically paralyzed on big conservation issues right now.
and with no dedicated naval force, how is enforcement even managed in this huge ocean, especially against illegal fishing?
It relies almost entirely on the commitment of individual member states. New Zealand, for example, is a major player here. They are very active in monitoring licensed fleets and, crucially, combating what's called IUU illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing.
So they're out there on patrol.
They are. They designate inspectors, they conduct regular maritime patrols in key areas like the Ross Sea, and they collaborate with other nations to make sure vessels are complying with the rules. Without that kind of committed national action, the CCAMR regulations would just be ink on paper.
We've established that the whole system was designed to insulate Antarctica from global conflict, this idea of exceptionalism. But as global tensions have risen, that exceptionalism seems to be over. When did that wall start to crack?
The end of exceptionalism was stark and definitive in 2022 and 2023. At the Antarctic Treaty meetings, which are traditionally these very neutral forums, Russia's invasion of Ukraine was raised directly by multiple delegations. States like the UK issued strong condemnations. The whole atmosphere became toxic.
And that tension had practical consequences.
Immediately, it complicated every consensus decision, even on things that seemed purely administrative, like accepting new members. The applications by countries like Belarus and Canada to get full decision-making power are now being debated against this deeply fraught backdrop of global alignment. The political consensus needed for the system just to function is eroding.
And speaking of alignment, we're seeing this massive coordinated expansion of infrastructure by key non-claimant states, particularly China and Russia. Let's start with China.
China's expansion is striking for its speed and its scale. They just opened their fifth station, the Kunming Station, in the Ross Sea in 2024. And they have detailed plans for a sixth summer station at a place called Cox Point in Marie Byrd Land.
And while they say it's for peaceful purposes,
Right. China's public documents reaffirm their opposition to commercial resource extraction. But this rapid increase in capacity, which includes dual-use features like satellite ground facilities, has led the U.S. and Australia to voice concerns about potential undeclared mineral exploration or even future military support capabilities.
and Russia seems to be making a strategic move in the same exact area.
It's a clear pattern. Russia announced plans to recommission its Rizhskaya station, which is also in Birdland, and has been dormant since 1990. And the key detail is its planned function. It's slated to be operated year-round by Roscosmos, the Russian space agency, for monitoring satellites.
So moving beyond pure climate science.
Exactly. It's moving into the domain of strategic communications and space situational awareness.
And what's the significance of these two new facilities being so close to each other?
Well, this is what's fascinating. The proposed new Chinese station at Cox Point will be only about 17 kilometers from the recommissioned Russian Rizhskaya station.
That's not a coincidence.
No, absolutely not. That close proximity suggests a shared logistical approach and a coordinated expansion of strategic presence in Marie Byrd Land. And that area is highly significant. It's the only large, unclaimed sector of the continent and a place with deep historic U.S. connections. Placing two major, strategically focused facilities there is a powerful statement.
This expansion leads us right back to the resource threat, specifically the hydrocarbon question. A Russian document surfaced that seemed to completely ignore the mining ban.
This incident caused genuine alarm. It was in a document related to Russia's legal arguments against proposed marine protected areas. In it, Russia stated explicitly that creating these MPAs would lead to the loss of the opportunity to develop hydrocarbon resources by Russia on the continental shelf of Antarctica.
Wait a second. If the Madrid Protocol indefinitely bans all mineral resource activity, why would Russia even use that language?
That is the perplexing and deeply troubling contradiction. Article 7 of the protocol is unambiguous. Russia is bound by it. The fact that they would formally state that MPAs are a hindrance to future hydrocarbon development suggests they are either maintaining strategic ambiguity about the ban's long-term viability, or they're positioning themselves to challenge it if it becomes technologically or economically feasible down the line.
And this isn't just a one-off comment. It fits a pattern of obstruction.
It does. If you connect the dots, it's clear. China and Russia have consistently used the consensus mechanism to block key conservation decisions in CCMLR. They have been the primary blockers preventing the establishment of huge new MPAs in the Weddell Sea and East Antarctica.
And why are they so against MPAs?
The concern is simple: future access and resource certainty. The demand for krill for aquaculture feed is projected to explode. So fishing states, particularly China and Russia, want to maintain operational flexibility. By blocking MPAs, they keep their options open and ensure that their rational use interpretation remains dominant over pure conservation science.
The geopolitical tension is one thing, but the climate crisis is testing the continent's physical stability and with it the stability of the entire planet.
That is the most profound reality the ATS has to face. Antarctica is warming at a rate between 0.22 and 0.32 degrees Celsius per decade. That's nearly double the global average. The West Antarctic ice sheet in particular is undergoing what appears to be irreversible change.
And the global implications of that melting, they're catastrophic.
The detail here is essential. The total melt of the Antarctic ice sheet holds the potential for a 58-meter global sea level rise.
Which feels abstract, almost unimaginable.
It does. But the danger is much more immediate. Even a 1-meter rise in sea level, which many scientists see as inevitable this century, puts 52% of the global population and 46% of global assets in coastal areas at risk of flooding. The failure of the ETS to respond effectively isn't just an Antarctic problem, it's a global security crisis.
So, given those stakes, the ETS has been surprisingly slow to respond, hasn't it?
That's a fair critique. The system has been very reluctant to engage with the broader, difficult discussion around global emissions reduction. They tend to argue that the root causes of climate change have to be dealt with at the UN in the UNFCCC process.
So their focus has been more internal.
Very much so. They focus on reducing the environmental footprint of their own research operations, their logistics, rather than trying to dictate global policy.
Have there been any recent steps, though? Are they starting to confront the reality?
There has been some movement. In 2023, the Helsinki Declaration was adopted. It was significant because it reaffirmed the indefinite ban on commercial mining, basically committing to keep fossil fuels in the ground. But more powerfully, it recognized the extinction risk faced by emperor penguins due to sea ice loss.
I saw those numbers. The breeding failures are staggering.
They are. 42% of emperor penguin colonies suffered total or partial breeding failure between 2018 and 2022 because the sea ice they need just broke up too early. The ATS is now being forced to confront species loss driven directly by climate change.
Which brings us back to the core dilemma. Why, with all this scientific urgency, is the system still so paralyzed on things like creating new marine protected areas?
It circles back entirely to that consensus decision-making model. In a time of planetary crisis, that model becomes a severe impediment. Every major conservation decision requires unanimous agreement. Since nations like China and Russia prioritize future resource access, they consistently use their veto. So a tiny minority of states can block vital climate-driven conservation that the vast majority support. The result is inaction.
And beyond the melting and the gridlock, you have threats coming from far outside the region, breaching the continent's pristine environment.
Yes, Antarctica isn't immune. We now find microplastics in Antarctic snow, transported thousands of kilometers, and the huge increase in ship traffic, both for science and tourism, raises the constant risk of introducing non-indigenous and invasive species.
And now disease, too.
Exactly. Diseases like highly pathogenic avian influenza or bird flu. It could be introduced by migratory birds and just decimate the massive, dense, and immunologically naive populations of seabirds and mammals down there. The APS is now having to consider biosecurity protocols that were unthinkable 20 years ago.
When a system struggles to adapt to these kinds of existential threats, you often see radical ideas emerge to try and break the deadlock. One concept that's getting traction is granting Antarctica legal personhood. That sounds nice, but how would that actually work?
That's the critical challenge the idea aims to overcome. The vision, championed by environmental lawyers like Cormac Cullinan, is revolutionary. He argues that Antarctica should be legally recognized as an autonomous legal entity, or a being in its own right.
So moving its status from a territory to something else.
Exactly. Shifting it from a contested laboratory into what he calls an astounding living community. The idea is to move beyond the current model, which is all about national interests, and focus instead on the duties we owe to the continent's own integrity.
So the goal is to create a legal tool that operates outside the political gridlock of the ATS.
Precisely. If Antarctica had a legal voice, it could, in theory, initiate or join lawsuits globally. It could sue major emitters, arguing their emissions are causing catastrophic harm not just to humans, but to the legal entity of Antarctica itself. It tries to reframe the debate from politics to legal rights and duties.
It's a fascinating idea, but let's bring it back to the messy reality right now. If a crime happens on the ice, who actually enforces the law in this sovereignty-free zone?
Enforcement and jurisdiction are incredibly complex. You have to remember that under the ATS, a nation's own laws apply to its citizens. So South African law applies to all its citizens in Antarctica. The U.S. stations special deputy marshals to ensure U.S. law applies to its nationals for serious crimes.
But the real problem is when jurisdictions collide.
It is. And the Rodney Marks case is the grim, perfect illustration of this jurisdictional mess.
Tell us that story.
Rodney Marks was an Australian astrophysicist. He died tragically in May 2000 while wintering over at the U.S. South Pole Station. The U.S. initially said it was natural causes, but the autopsy done in New Zealand revealed he died of methanol poisoning.
So a murder investigation was needed. Who had the authority to run it?
And there's the problem. The New Zealand police launched an investigation, but because the death happened at a U.S. station, the U.S. authorities were controlling access to witnesses and evidence. Jurisdictional issues prevented the New Zealand police from even issuing warrants for potential U.S. witnesses. The whole process just stalled.
That is the ultimate legal absurdity. The world agrees to ban war, but the system can't effectively prosecute a homicide because of bureaucratic friction between friendly nations.
It highlights the core limitation. The ATS successfully managed geopolitical competition at the high state level, but it failed to create a unified, functional, legal enforcement mechanism for individual actions. The Marks case remains unsolved to this day.
So in this environment of geopolitical risk, resource rivalry, and legal confusion, who provides the logistical backbone and the security presence to make sure the treaty actually works?
That responsibility falls largely on the nations with the heaviest presence, particularly the U.S. Coast Guard. Their work, primarily through Operation Deep Freeze, is absolutely essential. The Coast Guard breaks the sea ice channel so massive resupply ships can reach McMurdo Station, the largest facility on the continent.
So they're more than just a logistics lifeline, they're also an enforcer.
Absolutely. The USCG serves as the primary U.S. maritime law enforcement and naval presence in the Southern Ocean. They are vital for asserting the credibility of the ATS. They deter threats, they patrol against illegal fishing, and they inspect vessels to make sure they're complying with the Polar Code. That constant operational presence is what gives the ATS's rules real teeth on the water.
The Antarctic Treaty System remains this crowning achievement of 20th century diplomacy. It took a deeply contested region full of military tension and somehow reserved it for peace and science for over 6 decades. It really did buy the world time.
It did. But as we've seen, the clock is ticking faster than ever. The system is facing this unprecedented convergence of threats, geopolitical expansion, this veiled resource rivalry over krill and hydrocarbons, and the overwhelming existential force of global climate change. The core legal structures are resilient, but their effectiveness is paralyzed by the very thing that made them work in the first place. Consensus.
It's a profound contradiction, isn't it? A resilient framework that's being exploited by nations, prioritizing future resource access over immediate critical conservation needs, all while the planet changes around them.
It is. And this raises the final critical question. The Antarctic Treaty was designed to manage great power competition in a frozen, resource-rich land. But as the ice melts, making those resources more accessible, and as climate change makes the continent's stability more globally essential, the true test of the treaty might not be a formal declaration of sovereignty.
What will it be then?
The ultimate measure of its success will be whether the world's leading powers can finally overcome their entrenched national self-interest. Can they use consensus to protect the continent's unique and globally essential future before the accelerating planetary crisis dictates the terms of Antarctica's survival and, by extension, our own?